You don't deserve her. Eric Clapton said it the way men say the things they've been carrying too long. Not loud, not dramatic, but low and flat and final. The way a door sounds when it closes, and you know it's not going to open again. He was leaning forward. His elbows were on his knees. His eyes locked on George Harrison like he had already rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, and had finally stopped being afraid of it. The room went completely still. Not the kind of still where people are waiting for something to happen. The kind of still where people already know something has happened, and are simply holding their breath while the damage finishes spreading. George Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He did not reach for anything. Not a word, not a defense, not the controlled outrage that every instinct in a man should have handed him right then. He was the quiet beetle. He had spent his entire life being underestimated in rooms exactly like this one. Rooms full of noise, full of people who mistook stillness for weakness. He sat with Clapton's words the way he sat with everything. Completely. And then he said something back. Something so quiet, so stripped of everything you'd expect, that Eric Clapton, a man who had faced stadium crowds, screaming press, and the absolute wreckage of his own addiction, later admitted he didn't know what to do with it. What Harrison said in that room rearranged something inside him that he spent the next 30 years trying to put back into words. Most people know the shape of this story. The love triangle, the songs, the wife who left, the friendship that should have died and somehow didn't. But the version most people know is missing the one moment that explains all the others. The single choice George Harrison made in that room that no man in his position was supposed to make. What he did next wasn't rage. It wasn't silence. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implies the other person asked for it. It was something else entirely. Something that cost him more than losing Pattie Boyd ever did. Stay with us through every second of this story, because by the time it ends, you will never think about strength, friendship, or betrayal the same way again. Before we go any further, if you've been waiting for the story that proves strength is not the same thing as loudness, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what's coming in the next 6 sections is the part of this story that history almost forgot to save. But to understand what Harrison said in that room and why it broke Eric Clapton far more completely than any fight ever could have, you have to go back to before Pattie Boyd, before Clapton, before any of it. You have to go back to a boy in Liverpool who taught himself to play guitar on fingers that bled, and who built his entire life around one belief, that the truest thing a man can do is mean what he plays. George Harold Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in a small terraced house at 12 Arnold Grove, Wavertree, Liverpool. The smallest bedroom in the smallest house on a street where everyone knew everyone and nobody had very much and nobody pretended otherwise. His father, Harold, drove a bus. His mother, Louise, was the kind of woman who believed in her children so completely that her belief functioned like a second skeleton, something they stood on when their own bones weren't enough. George was the youngest of 4, quiet from the beginning, not shy exactly, more like someone who had decided early that listening was more interesting than talking, and had never found enough evidence to change his mind. He discovered the guitar at 13, not because someone handed it to him, because he hunted it down. He spent weeks convincing his mother to help him buy a second-hand Egmont acoustic for £3 and 10 shillings. He practiced until his fingertips cracked and bled, and then he practiced more, because the music on the other side of the pain was worth every bit of it. By 15, he had already played his way into John Lennon's band. By 21, he had played on a stage in front of 55,000 screaming people at Shea Stadium, New York, and still felt, quietly, privately, in the place underneath all the noise, that the world had no idea who he actually was. That was the thing about being a Beatle. It made you enormous and invisible at the same time. Lennon had his fury. McCartney had his charm. Ringo had the warmth that made everyone feel safe. And Harrison had something harder to name, a depth that the others reached for in their best moments and lived in permanently. He wrote something in 1969. Frank Sinatra called it the greatest love song of the last 50 years. Harrison wrote it in 20 minutes, almost accidentally, the way people sometimes produce their truest work, not by trying harder, but by finally getting out of their own way. He was 26 years old, and Pattie Boyd had been his wife for 3 years. She had walked onto the set of A Hard Day's Night in March 1964. 19 years old, blonde, working as a film extra, and George Harrison had seen her across a room and known something immediately, the way people occasionally know things before they have any right to. He asked her to marry him the same afternoon he met her. She laughed. He wasn't joking. They married on January 21st, 1966. And somewhere in the crowd that day, not yet introduced, not yet dangerous, was the man who would spend the next decade trying to take her. Eric Clapton entered George Harrison's life the way most dangerous things do, through a door Harrison himself opened. It was September 1968. The Beatles were deep inside the recording sessions that would become the White Album. Weeks of tension, fraying egos, and the particular exhaustion that comes from 4 brilliant men slowly running out of patience for each other. Harrison had written a song, a quiet, searching, devastating song about looking for love in a world that kept handing him everything except the thing he actually needed. He called it While My Guitar Gently Weeps. He wanted Clapton to play the lead guitar. Clapton said no, said it wouldn't be right. You didn't just walk into a Beatles session. Harrison looked at him and said something that would echo through the next 30 years of both their lives. It's my song, and I need it to sound like you. Clapton picked up the guitar. He played the solo in a single afternoon. When he finished, everyone in the studio knew they had just heard something that would outlast all of them. Harrison had handed Clapton his most personal song, and Clapton had responded by handing Clapton himself the keys to Harrison's home, his circle, his wife. The visits to the house in Esher began casually, then regularly, then at hours that didn't require explanation. Pattie noticed. Harrison noticed. But Harrison, being Harrison, said nothing, because saying something would have meant choosing between his friendship and his marriage, and he was still trying to believe he didn't have to choose. Clapton wasn't trying to hide it anymore. By 1971, he had stopped pretending entirely. He wrote Pattie Boyd a letter, handwritten, personal, and absolutely cornered, that told her if she did not leave Harrison and come to him, he would go to heroin. Not as a metaphor, not as poetry, as a promise. She didn't leave. He kept the promise. What followed were 3 years that nearly killed Eric Clapton. He disappeared into addiction so complete that friends stopped calling because they didn't know what to say and started calling because they were checking if he was still alive. His weight dropped. His hands, the hands that had played the solo on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, shook. The greatest guitarist of his generation was dissolving in a house in Surrey over a woman who was still married to his best friend. And George Harrison knew about the letter. He knew what Clapton had threatened. He knew what Clapton had done. He knew all of it. And what he chose to do with that knowledge was so unexpected, so utterly outside what anyone who knew the story would have predicted, that the people who witnessed it still struggle to explain it decades later. He organized the intervention. Let that land for a moment. Eric Clapton had sent a written ultimatum to George Harrison's wife. He had followed through on a heroin threat when she didn't leave. He had spent 3 years destroying himself, publicly, completely, in full view of everyone who knew both men. And George Harrison's response was to pick up the phone and start making calls to save his life. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it was easy, because Harrison had decided, somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody else could see, that Clapton's life was worth saving, regardless of what Clapton had done with it. In 1973, Pete Townshend of The Who organized the Rainbow Concert, a single live performance designed to pull Clapton back from the edge, to put him on a stage in front of an audience and remind him who he was before the addiction rewrote him. It was a desperate idea, and it was the only idea anyone had left. Harrison didn't just support it, he played it. He stood on that stage at the Rainbow Theatre in London on January 13, 1973, and played guitar beside the man who had been systematically dismantling his marriage for 4 years. The audience didn't know all of it. The people in that room didn't know all of it. But Harrison knew every single word of the letter Clapton had written to Pattie. He knew the threat. He knew the years. He stood on that stage anyway. That was the first unthinkable thing. What happened in the room? The confrontation that opened this story came sometime after. Clapton was fragile, coming back to himself in pieces. And the friendship between the two men had reached the moment that every friendship built over a buried secret eventually reaches. The moment where the secret has to come up or the friendship has to come apart. You don't deserve her. When Clapton finally said it out loud, Harrison didn't collapse, didn't explode. He sat with it the way he sat with a chord that wasn't resolving, patiently, without panic, waiting to hear where it wanted to go. And then he said, "I know." Not in defeat, not in self-pity, in the voice of a man who had already had this conversation with himself so many times that hearing it from someone else was almost a relief. "I know I haven't been everything she needed. I know what you feel. I've known for years, Eric. I've known since before you did." Clapton had come into that room carrying a weapon. Harrison had just taken it apart with 2 words. "But hear me clearly," Harrison continued, quiet as a man who never needs volume because the room always goes still for him anyway. "If she chooses you, I won't stand in the way. I mean that. But you need to become someone worth choosing. You can't keep destroying yourself over a woman who hasn't left her husband. That is not love. That is possession. And you know the difference." He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. Then he stopped, turned back once. "You're my brother, Eric. That doesn't change because you're in love with my wife. But it has to mean something to you, or it means nothing to either of us." He walked out. Clapton sat in that room alone for a long time afterward. By every account from people who knew him in that period, something shifted in him that afternoon. Not immediately, not cleanly, but permanently. Harrison had denied him the one thing Clapton had unconsciously needed to keep the obsession alive: an enemy. Without an enemy, Clapton had nowhere to put the feeling except back inside himself, where it finally, slowly, painfully, began to transform into something he could actually live with. Pattie Boyd left Harrison in 1974. The divorce was finalized in 1977. She married Eric Clapton on March 27, 1979, in Tucson, Arizona. George Harrison attended the wedding. There is a photograph from that wedding. Harrison standing in the church in Tucson, dressed quietly, the way he dressed for everything. No performance in it, no announcement. Olivia Arias beside him, the woman he would marry 4 months later. His face carrying the particular expression of someone who has already made peace with something the rest of the room is still trying to understand. He was not there in defeat. He was not there to prove anything. He was there because Eric Clapton was his brother and Pattie Boyd had been his wife, and both of those things were true at the same time. And Harrison had never been the kind of man who needed the world to be simpler than it actually was. Pattie later said it was the most graceful thing she had ever seen a human being do. The marriage between Clapton and Boyd lasted 10 years. It was not easy. Clapton's sobriety fractured. His faithfulness fractured. The obsession that had fueled a decade of pursuit turned out to be a different thing entirely once it was no longer an obsession. Once it was just a Tuesday morning, just a shared breakfast, just the ordinary weight of two people trying to build something real out of what had started as a fantasy. Boyd eventually left in 1988. The great love story that had nearly destroyed 3 lives turned out to be most powerful as a longing and considerably more complicated as a life. But the friendship between Harrison and Clapton never broke. In 1987, Harrison released Cloud 9, his comeback record, the one that reminded a generation of listeners that the quiet Beatle had never actually gone quiet, only private. He needed a guitarist. He called Clapton, not as a gesture, not as a statement, as a musician who knew exactly whose hands he wanted on the instrument beside him. Clapton came. They recorded together the way they always had. 2 men whose connection had been forged in something too complicated for either of them to fully explain, and too real for either of them to walk away from. In his 2007 autobiography, simply titled Clapton, Eric Clapton wrote about the pursuit of Pattie Boyd with a directness that surprised even the people who already knew the story. He didn't soften it. He didn't reframe it. He described the heroin letter. He described the ultimatum. He described the years of wreckage. And then he described Harrison's response, the concert, the confrontation, the wedding attendance, and said it was the thing he had never been able to fully deserve or fully explain. He called Harrison's refusal to become an enemy the single most disorienting act of decency he had ever been shown by another human being. Because Clapton had spent years building the architecture of a rivalry, and Harrison had simply refused to move into it. That refusal cost Harrison something real. It cost him the clean story, the one where he was wronged, and everyone knew it, and the sympathy was uncomplicated. Instead, he got something harder and rarer, the truth, which was that he had loved both of them, in different ways, and had chosen to keep loving them, even when love was the most inconvenient thing he could possibly have chosen. His son Donnie was born in August 1978. Olivia was his foundation in the years that followed, steady, private, exactly the kind of presence Harrison had always needed, and only found once he stopped expecting the world to provide it. He retreated to Friar Park, his Victorian mansion in Henley-on-Thames, and spent years restoring it with his own hands, planting, building, making something permanent out of something that had been left to ruin. He had learned, it seemed, to do that with most things. By November 2001, George Harrison was dying. Lung cancer, first diagnosed in 1997, had spread. The tumor that had moved into his brain was no longer responding to treatment. He was 58 years old. He had lived 11 more years than John Lennon. He had made peace with most things, with the Beatles, with Pattie, with the decades of noise that had tried to drown out the quiet he had always been searching for underneath all of it. In the final weeks, he made phone calls, not to journalists, not to the machinery of legacy management that surrounds famous men as they approach the end. He called the people he wanted to hear one more time. Eric Clapton was on that list, near the top of it. By Clapton's own account, Harrison called him, not to settle anything, not to extract a final confession or a final apology, but simply to talk, the way old friends talk when time has burned away everything that wasn't essential, and what's left is just 2 men who have known each other longer than most of their lives. Clapton said he spent most of the call trying not to cry, while Harrison made jokes. Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at 11:30 in the morning in Los Angeles, quietly, the way he had always preferred to do the most important things. In his will, he left Eric Clapton his favorite guitar. No letter, no explanation, no final word attached to it. Just the instrument, the most personal object a guitarist owns, passed from one set of hands to the other without ceremony, the way Harrison had always communicated the things that mattered most. not through what he said, but through what he played. 1 year later, on November 29, 2002, Clapton stood on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall and organized the Concert for George. 2.5 hours of Harrison's music, performed by the people who had loved him. At the end of the night, visibly undone in a way that no camera could be polite about, Clapton leaned into the microphone. "He was the best of us," he said. 4 words. No decoration. The truest thing Eric Clapton ever said out loud, and the only eulogy George Harrison would have accepted without arguing. George Harrison never gave a single interview about what Eric Clapton did. Not one. He never positioned himself as the man who was wronged, never leaked the letter to the press, never allowed the story to be told in a way that made him the sympathetic center of it. He had every right to that story. He chose a different one instead, one where the people he loved were protected even from the version of events that would have made him look best. That is not weakness. That is the rarest kind of strength there is, the kind that doesn't need a witness. He wrote All Things Must Pass. He built his garden. He played the Rainbow Concert. He attended the wedding. He called Clapton back for Cloud 9. He left him the guitar. He made the phone call at the end. Every single choice was the harder one, and he made every single one of them quietly, without announcement, without asking anyone to notice. The strongest thing George Harrison ever did wasn't a psalm, a riff, or a spiritual pilgrimage to India. It was the decision, made repeatedly over 30 years, to refuse to become the thing that was done to him. And in the end, the man who once said he didn't deserve Pattie Boyd stood on a stage in front of the world and called him the best of them all. Some people earn their legacy through what they build. George Harrison earned his through what he refused to destroy. Drop a comment right now and tell us which moment in this story hit you the hardest. The wedding, the guitar, the phone call at the end. We read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people find stories about the kind of strength that never once asked to be seen. Subscribe, hit the bell, and click the next video on your screen right now, because the story waiting for you there is just as powerful as this one.